Hello, friends. So today we're going to discuss the second of the 4 agreements, and this is out of this book if you're interested in learning more. And if you haven't watched yesterday's video or the first video, it's on being impeccable with your word. I recommend you doing that because they kind of build off of one another. They are they can sit on their or stand on their own, but they just will flow better together, especially with the way that I'll probably present them. And so the second agreement is don't take anything personally. I know that this can be hard. It can be hard to not let that happen. It can be hard to know when we're doing it and when we're not. It can be hard to just understand what that really means. Something that was super helpful for me was, and I believe this was in the book, but when I read about how actually taking things personally can be very much about self-importance and be selfish, because we end up making assumptions that everything is actually about us. And when I heard that, I'm like, well, no, I don't want to be like that. I gotta work on this. And so I did. So I don't know why. It just seems like I tend to have driving or examples from driving to illustrate stuff. But I think that this is a good one. When we think about people who get upset, like in traffic or parking lots or something like that, if you watch that reaction, it's as if they are taking it personally. But we've all been on the other side of it. And I'm there. There are times when I'm like, use your blinker, right? How rude, right? Like they did that to me. They just were like, oh, I'm going to make that woman. I don't think I like her. She's crazy. We're just going to not use our blinker and make her have to sit there for an extra 5 seconds. No, that's not at all what's happening, because we've been the people who forgot to turn our blinker. Most of the time we're unaware of it. We're not even aware that there's another vehicle coming, or we have our own things going or whatever. But it almost never has anything to do with anybody else. It's just when we're making traffic decisions, we're kind of in our own car. We're doing what we were doing. And it typically does not have anything to do with anything else until we do take it personally. Until somebody else does something and we're like, well, I don't like that. And then somebody's going to do something back. And then all of a sudden it becomes like a road rage-a-thon of craziness. But point being, that's just one example of how, isn't it interesting how selfish or self-important we make that. We're like, yes, they cared that much about me, a random person in another car, that they wanted to make my life a little bit more inconvenient today. Most likely that is not happening. And that's true for most everything in this world. So when people are doing things, even if it's directly against you, like they call you a name or something like that, it really has less to do with you and more to do with them, because they have their own stories, their own narratives, their own things that they're working through, their own histories, stressors, life experiences that have them believing and acting, reacting in certain ways. And so you just might be on the receiving end of that. Knowing that, I love this example too of how you could, you as yourself, could interview 50 random people in your life and have them just write in a couple sentences, what do you think of this person? What do you think of you? And everyone could have a completely different picture of who they believe you are or what they see about you. And who's right? None of them, right? Because they only see it. Well, I had this one interaction with her or him and it went this way, so I think they're a great leader. Or I had this this situation. You know what? It's based on their own filter of how they perceive you. That's the reality. And so when we take it personally, then we're saying their perception of us becomes our truth. And that's not real. That's not it. Our truth is our truth. No one else's truth is our truth. So in the last video, when we talked about being impeccable with our word, we talked about how somebody can say something negative and it could influence somebody else. But that's where our power comes in, because we don't have to let those words influence us, because that's the poison they're handing out. It's up to us if we're going to consume it. If we're going to plant that seed that's being passed around, that's our choice. That's our ability to decipher and do with it what we want. Because no one can make us feel a certain way. The feeling is cultivated from within. The thoughts get like we create those on our own. Somebody can influence it, but we decide if we're going to allow it in, or if we're going to allow it to take on a feeling or a mentality or a belief. It can totally grow. Now, when we're kids, it's harder. That's a different story, because as a child growing up, we don't have that empowerment yet. We don't have that wisdom. We're still trying to figure out our self-concept, and we're trying to figure out who we are. As we grow into adulthood, a lot of times we still don't know this. So we're still taking it in. Somebody says something, you don't know how to do this, or we interpret messages too. It's not even directly that people say stuff or do stuff. We just can interpret it a certain way, and then we drink the poison. And so it's up to us to not allow that to come in, and not allow it to influence our thoughts and beliefs and our emotions. That's not always easy, but it is something that's super important. This also means, so like even the negatives, if somebody's complaining about you or whatever, like there's always good, like to be able to not take it personally is just to look at it and see, is there any validity to this? Is there something I could have done better? Is there something that it's a valid complaint? And then leave the emotion aside, and then we can work through that. But if we're going to get like super defensive because we've taken it personally, then there's really no room for growth. We're not able to grow as an individual or in the relationship. That's not always easy, but that's a practice to do. But this is also going to be really hard too. It also means not taking personally when we get compliments. So if somebody comes to you and says like, oh, you are just the best at baking, or something like that, and they're really feeding that, it's feeding that ego. That's not, that's still their perception. It's awesome to feel those things and to hear those things. Yes, it's always great to feel appreciated, for sure. But to know too that if we attach our truth to that person's perception of positivity, then it's also going to make us more likely to accept when other people are saying things that are negative. Hopefully that makes sense. So either way, we just have to always come back to what is within me, what feels right. So I'm not dependent on other people's point of view for me. So then when we're able to do that, because a lot of times we don't trust ourselves, it's hard for us to make decisions, it's hard for us to know what to do, because we become so dependent on other people and their impact and what they might think or their opinions, that we don't ever fully explore that trust. And we really have to get to that that allowing of our own trust to develop, so that we don't need it from other people. And there's such a huge freedom that comes to not taking things personally, because then you become immune to the viruses that we were talking about in the last video, about the viruses of people saying things if they're not impeccable with their word, or even in ourselves. We can be like, if we find ourselves like pondering a thought that doesn't really serve us, or that's not in our highest interest, then we know that's not true. Like that's not something that I want to continue to feed or to plant. And so then we can let it go. And there's such freedom with that. It's like the whole world could be gossiping about you, and you understand, like, it doesn't matter. It only matters about what, like, me living in integrity, doing the best that I can, which is in another video, and knowing my own self well enough that other people's opinions won't shake the foundation of who I really am. So knowing that you're never responsible for the actions of others, but you are responsible for your own. So when things happen, and things will happen, and things trigger you, because things will trigger you, can you ask yourself if you're taking it personally, and what you could do instead? How you could let that go, how you could see that in a fresh way with a neutral mind, and not plant that seed and not feed those things that are not going to be in your best interest.